Well, today is the day that theism has been defeated. So, as some of you might be aware, Joe Schmid of Magic of Reason has recently published a very interesting video on what he considers to be at least the best argument for atheism. You can find the link in the description. The title of the video is called The Best Argument for Atheism You've Never Heard of Before. So, what's interesting about this argument, and I'll go over the argument in a minute, is that I actually don't necessarily disagree with it, even as a theist myself, which is the reason why I consider it to be the best argument because it's one of the rare arguments for atheism that you'll find that I think a theist should, be sympathetic to. And I'll explain the reasons why as we go over the argument itself. But what I would say is that given this argument, at least given the way that it's presented, theists need a little bit more work to do. But it's not too bad. Not too much work, but just a little tiny bit. And we're going to go over that today. All right. So here is the argument. You can find it again in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I'm not going to go over everything that's in this section, but I will go over at least the main premises of the argument. So, what are the premises of the argument? Well, very simple. Premise 1. Atheistic deism is at least as probable intrinsically as omnitheism. Premise 2. The total evidence excluding the data of good and evil does not favor omnitheism over atheistic deism. And 3. Given the total evidence excluding the data of good and evil, the data of good and evil strongly favor atheistic deism over omnitheism. It follows 1, 2, and 3 that atheistic deism is as many times more probable than omnitheism. It follows from 4 that omnitheism is very probably false. In conclusion, atheism, understood here as simply just the denial of omnitheism, is very probably true. Now, here's the interesting part about this argument, which is that depending on which one you want to attack, it's actually, let's say, it's difficult to attack. And the reason why is very simple. Because any data point that you want to point to that's going to favor omnitheism, against atheistic deism is going to have to be very, very specific. And the reason why that's the case is, well, there's a few reasons. First of all, the first reason why this might be a problem or might be controversial is simply by the fact that if we look at the first premise, okay, it's literally, so there is no difference between the two hypotheses here. The only difference is in terms of God's motivation. So on aesthetic deism, God is motivated by aesthetic goods, or to pursue aesthetic goods, and in omnitheism, God is motivated to pursue moral goods. Okay. And so this leads us to the second premise, which is the total evidence excluding the data of good and evil does not favor omnitheism over aesthetic deism. Now, some people might say, well, what about, what about moral knowledge? Like, wouldn't that technically be evidence for omnitheism against atheistic deism? My response to that is, well, no, because on atheistic deism, God is interested, or at least this deistic God, I should say, is interested in pursuing beauty, goodness, right? That understanding of goodness. So what's interesting about that is you can have aesthetic reasons for creating moral agents. You can have aesthetic reasons, let's say, for a fine-tuned universe as well. So it explains the fine-tuning data. It explains the moral awareness data. It can account. So if you, let's say you accept the Kalam cosmological argument, you can accept that argument, because you're talking about basically a God that created the universe for aesthetic reasons. So it's really difficult, right, to say that, okay, atheistic deism would, lose on evidence, right? And the reason why that's the case is because all the evidence for theism, like consciousness, fine-tuning, um, moral awareness, those kind of things, anything you can really point to, right? Well, let's just say that all the reasons that the omnitheistic God might have to pursue those goods are going to be equally available to the aesthetic deist God. So you're going to run into a problem there in terms of which hypothesis actually has more explanatory power, at least when we're talking about the natural theological data, meaning the data that is traditionally assigned to, support theism. And so that's the first issue, is that any data point that you might point to that might favor omnitheism is going to equally be explained by atheistic deism. And again, the reason why is just simply because any moral reasons that God has to create those things is going to be equally available for the atheistic deist God to also equally create those things. So that leads us to the third premise, which is that given the total evidence excluding the dad, good, and evil, the dad, good, and evil strongly favor atheistic deism over omnitheism. So here's the thing with that argument, and I'm going to go a little bit into how Draper defends this. All right, so here is Draper's defense of premise 3. And basically, again, premise 3 is simply that the data of good and evil itself is actually what supports atheistic deism over omnitheism. And what's interesting about this is he actually cites the book of Job to defend this premise. So here's sort of how he presents it, right? Finally, there's premise 3, which asserts that the data good and evil decisively favors atheistic deism over theism. In this context, the data good and evil includes everything we know about how sentient beings, including humans, are benefited or harmed. A full discussion of this premise is not plausible here, but recognition of its plausibility appears to be as old as probable itself. Consider, for example, the book of Job, whose protagonist, a righteous man who suffers horrifically, accuses God of lacking sufficient commitment of the moral value of justice. The vast majority of commenters agree that God does not directly respond to Job's charge. Instead, speaking out of the whirlwind, he describes his design of the cosmos and the animal kingdom in a way that clearly intended to emphasize his power and grandeur over his creation. So what Draper is pointing out here is that the God in the book of Job is sort of an aesthetic God, right? He's pointing to his creation, how, doesn't really, is not really interested in the moral questions, but really is more interested in the aesthetic questions, or at least aesthetic reasons that God has. And if you go down, right, uh, even Darwin himself believes something like this was the case, and Draper himself cites Darwin in this way. So he says much of the aesthetic value of the animal kingdom may also depend on it being the result of a long evolutionary process driven by mechanisms like natural selection. As Darwin famously said in the lines of The Origin of Species, there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms into one another, and that wishful this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity. From so simple a being, endless forms, most beautiful and wonderful, have been, are being evolved. Sorry, he's kind of like a weird. Darwin's sort of like a weird. He writes in a weird way, so I apologize if I mispronounced that. But right, the whole idea is that unfortunately such a process, if it is to produce sentient life, must also entail much suffering and countless early deaths. One questionable assumption of this sort of some natural order theodicies is to think that such connections between aesthetic goods and suffering provide moral justification for God allowing horrific suffering. It is arguably far more plausible that in such a scenario, the value of preventing horrific suffering would, from a moral point of view, far outweigh the value of regularity, sublimity, and narrative. If so, then a morally perfect God would not trade the former for the latter, though a deity motivated primarily by aesthetic reasons no doubt would. So basically, what Draper is pointing to, what he's trying to really say, is that, hey, any aesthetic reasons that God might have for allowing for horrific suffering, or any suffering in general, is simply just not going to translate well into moral justifications. Okay. And so the whole idea is like, if there is a God, then he wouldn't be a morally perfect God, but rather he would be a sort of aesthetic God. Because again, we're stipulating that there's aesthetic reasons that God allows for evils. So what's interesting about this is the framework that I developed in my own book actually sort of gets a little bit into this. I don't directly cite Draper here, but there is a similar concern, or at least a similar uh, somewhat familiar conclusion you might reach, or that I at least reached to at the time. And with that, I will now transition into explaining what exactly my view is. All right, now that that's taken care of, let's go to one book that I really like exploring, and that is my book on this subject. Let's go. All right, so we are now in this book, which is my book. I believe it's on page 36. It might be, or sorry, 38, where I give a definition of theism. So, in my book, I give a definition of theism, which is this: there is an omnipotent being that acts on the basis of axiological reasons. And I will clarify. Here, I understand an omnipotent being that is that has both perfect freedom of will and perfect efficiency of will. And God's will is guided by the entire axiological domain. Hence, God does not favor only moral goods, but he also wants to pursue all of the categories of goodness or value: moral, alethic, and aesthetic. This framework still allows for the possibility that God has overriding motivations to pursue certain values over others. Finally, our theory of best values will be influenced by this axiological domain, since best actions incorporate all values in this analysis. So, with that in mind, let's continue on, because now that we have that definition, it's good to clarify where exactly we can poke holes into Draper's argument. Okay, with that in mind, I want to also point out something that perhaps Draper hasn't perhaps taken into account, and that is that there are some theist philosophers, or some theistic philosophers, I should say, that have argued that just because God is good in the way that we understand it doesn't mean necessarily that he's morally good. You can read this position by Brian Davies. I will leave a link in the description. But here's the thing with the way that he is presenting this argument. Again, recall, he's presenting it as omnitheism, which is, by his understanding of omnitheism, is the view that God is interested in moral goodness on one side, and then you have aesthetic deism, where God is interested in aesthetic goodness. Well, the problem, of course, is that what if we take on axiological theism, which is the theism that I defined earlier as the view that there is an omnipotent being that acts on the basis of axiological reasons. If we take that definition, which I think is plausible definition, then God, yes, wants to pursue moral goods, but he also wants to pursue aesthetic goods and alethic goods. Why? Well, my theodicy is an alethic theodicy. It's an educative theodicy. So in my theodicy, I'm not going to get into the details of my theodicy, but my theodicy could be called an alethic theodicy. And that is, the reason for that is that God's reasons for allowing for evil and suffering are not purely moral reasons, although they could be understood as moral reasons, which I will get into in a minute. But they could be understood more broadly as alethic reasons. And so, if that's the case, if we take on axiological theism as sort of our main kind of theism, well, now aesthetic deism has the disadvantage. Because now, if you can find data that at least has not just simply moral goodness, but also alethic goodness that God wants to pursue, well, that's going to be aesthetic deism, and the reason why it's going to be aesthetic deism is simply because, well, axiological theism has much broader resources. God's motivations are going to be much wider on that framework. With this in mind, there is one more thing I want to point out with the argument, and that is the defeat condition. And how does that play into it? All right, so how does the defeat condition play into this? Well, I will briefly explain why this is relevant. So, the defeat condition is we can call it a moral condition that God is constrained by. So, the defeat condition states that an evil is defeated when it is integrated as a constituent part of a valuable composable whole that not only outweighs the evil, but could not be as valuable as the whole without the evil. This defeat is realized through the opportunity granted to creatures where the future remains open, and the creature's response determines how the evil is transformed into a greater good, allowing the potential for a richer, more meaningful whole. One way to understand this concept is through the lens of art. Artists often incorporate unattractive elements or kinds of aesthetic evils into the work, which, when viewed within the context of the entire artwork, contributes to the beauty, again, beauty of the larger art piece. Well, here's the thing with that, okay? And some people might not know this, but the defeat condition itself is an aesthetic condition. All right, so since the defeat condition is an aesthetic condition, what does this mean? Well, recall what Draper exactly said. One questionable assumption of some natural order theodicists is to think that such connections between aesthetic goods and suffering provide a moral justification for God's allowing horrific suffering. It is arguably far more plausible that in such a scenario, the value of preventing horrific suffering would, from a moral point of view, far outweigh the value of regularity, sublimity, and narrative. However, here's the issue, which is that the defeat condition is exactly that kind of moral justification. And the thing with the defeat condition, right, is that on that condition, what you would say is that there can be no evil which intrinsically prevents one from growing from it, which means that on theism, right, since all evils must eventually be defeated, right, or, you know, as long they must be defeatable in some capacity, um, that must imply that, okay, if someone goes through horrific suffering and then later on they retroactively consent to that suffering, in other words, they don't regret the life that they overall had with regards to the suffering, well, that would be consistent with the defeat condition, and it would override the, let's say, we can call it the prevention condition that Draper is sort of assuming here. Now, I think that Draper is correct to point out that under normal circumstances, if we are going to constrain God's morality to merely the human kind of morality that we're talking about, then yeah, um, preventing horrific suffering, might be the best way to go. But here on the moral framework that I'm presenting, or at least that I am assuming from the outset, is that God would be constrained not by that condition, not by the prevention condition, but by the defeat condition. And what that defeat condition does is it shows, or at least it justifies, that the connection between the aesthetic goods, so again, the aesthetic good in this case is going to be the defeat itself, and the suffering itself would provide a moral justification. So the moral justification on God's part is simply that any evil that occurs must be defeasible in some capacity. With that in mind, I now want to get to the final piece of the puzzle. All right, so here's the thing. Last month, I argued that the Tavik principle is the principle that guides at least God's morality. And I don't have the time to go over the full moral contextualist framework that I am assuming. But one thing to point out, one important thing to point out, is that the argument from evil, including the version that Draper is talking about here, relies upon axiology. It relies upon assumptions of value. So here's the thing with the argument, which is I agree with the conclusion of Draper's argument if we are restricting theism to simply just moral goods. However, if we understand theism more broadly as the thesis that God is not only interested in pursuing moral goods, but is also interested in pursuing alethic and aesthetic goods, well, that's going to leave a lot more room for the theist to explain the data, including the data of evil, right? So, if aesthetic deism can explain the data of evil because of some aesthetic reason that God might have to allow for evils, well, axiological theism also has the same resources to explain the evils given aesthetic reasons. And in fact, because the defeat principle is itself an aesthetic principle, that would be at least one of the main axiological, or at least aesthetic reasons that God might have. Now, of course, I don't think it's simply just aesthetic reasons. I don't think that God simply allows people just because of aesthetic reasons. So certainly, any comprehensive theodicy is going to need more than simply the defeat principle. And I go over in my book some alethic reasons that God would or might have in regards to allowing for the suffering to occur. But the important thing here is that on axiological theism, that would explain all the data that not only omnitheism would explain, as Draper defines it, but it would also explain all the data that aesthetic deism would explain. And so what's very interesting is that you can construct an argument for axiological theism based on the fact that there might be certain data points that favor axiological theism against both omnitheism, as Draper defines it, and against aesthetic deism, as Draper defines it. And so, with that in mind, in conclusion, there's two things to consider. Number one, as a theist, you do not necessarily have to disagree with Draper's argument. You could fully accept every premise of the argument, but simply maybe have a different understanding or twist to what he's saying. And number two, more importantly, is that you have axiological theism as an option, right? If you accept axiological theism, well, that's going to account not only for all the data that omnitheism can explain, but also all the data that aesthetic deism can explain. And it might even explain all the alethic data as well, right? So not only does it have broad enough explanatory power to encompass both the theories that Draper's talking about, but it's also much wider in explanatory power than both the theories put together. So, with that in mind, that's all I have to say. If you have any questions, please let me know.